Have you ever encountered true evil? How? Back in 2011 my uncle down in Mexico had got kidnapped by one of the cartels. They gave my entire family on my dad's side a random $10,000 and we would get him back. My dad called in people who owed him money and managed to get the 10 grams. He sent it down to the family down south and they paid the ransom for my uncle. All we got in return was my uncle's lifeless body. My birth mom was abusive. She beat my brother mercilessly and let her boyfriend molest him. She ignored all of us daughters. Went days without eating. When I was a boy, I had a wicked stepmother who reveled in beating me. She would beat me when my father was not present, threatened to kill my brother if I said anything. She would use whatever objects were convenient to beat me with. Wooden spoon, hairbrush, dowel rod, rolling pin, her hands, fists, belt, whatever. One time she used a serpentine belt. She'd hit me where it wouldn't be visible when my father wasn't around. At one point, she had me drop my pants and underwear, and beat me until I nearly passed out. I jerked out of pain and kicked of her lap, and got her in the face. She proceeded to pick me up by my leg and beat my balls with a wooden spoon. I'm not sure if she counted as evil, but she certainly counted as sadistic and vindictive. The first boyfriend I ever had, we were both 16. He was a pathological liar and a sociopath. He slowly became possessive and controlling, wanted to be together constantly, would accuse me of wearing things that were too revealing, isolated me from my friends. When I tried to break up with him, he threatened to rape me and kill my dog. He pushed me out of a slowly moving car while his grandmother was driving. I was dumb as a box of rocks and had no self-esteem, so I didn't know any better. I nearly changed schools. My parents put me in therapy among other things. Ruined the first 2 years of high school for me. Over 20 years later he sent me a message on Facebook asking me how I was. Like we were old fucking pals. I didn't respond. Maybe he changed as an adult, but I seriously doubt it. I found out he died a couple years ago. He was involved in a crime involving his young daughter and I'm pretty sure he was facing prison time. I honestly think the world is better off without him in it. I've told this story before, about meeting a murderer. Was a journalist on weekend duty. Got called out to a story. Guy claims his car was hijacked with his 2-year-old son in it. I met him at the police station. He seemed devastated. I was devastated. I mean, I'd done plenty of grisly crime stories, but a missing kid is next level awful. Next day I had my day off. The regular crime reporter called me. They'd arrested the dad and found the little boy's body at a rubbish dump. Did it out of revenge for his wife cheating. It still bothers me to this day how I could have felt so much sympathy for this man. I shook his hand, I cried with him. I'm usually very good at picking up when someone is off. Just goes to show you, true evil disguises itself very well. There was a kid in my 6th grade class who loved designing his own custom shanks and then stabbing people in the arm or back with them. He had a look of pure joy on his face when he saw that he drew blood and caused suffering to another human. He was only suspended for a week the first 2 times he did this before they finally kicked him out of school after the 3rd time. A few years ago a friend of mine was going through a nasty divorce, like really bad. He came to visit me one evening as I was getting off of work. When I sat down with him he just seemed off, like a completely different person than the man I had known before. Blank stare in his eyes, no smiling, anger behind everything he said. I chalked it up to the divorce and just thought to myself that he would get better when everything calmed down. I told my wife when I got home about seeing him and she agreed with my assessment. I bumped into his ex-wife and some friends a few days later at another work event. She was actually out celebrating their divorce being finalized I think, and she invited my wife and I over to a house party. That would be the last time I saw her. My wife and I ended up not going to the house party, but the ex-husband did show up. He killed 9 people, including his ex-wife. And #X200B, edit, this couple had been known for throwing parties prior to their divorce. That stopped when they began divorce proceedings of course. The party was not a celebration of their divorce. It was a Dallas Cowboys watch party and emo. It was her attempt and trying to do something she saw as normal after such a difficult time. I also believe this is why he focused on that. In Iraq there was a family that we would go see every other week or so while on patrol. We would ask them how things are going and if there was anything they needed us to do. They were a respected family in the area and did a lot to build their community to defend against the violence committed by the insurgency. It was a big family, lots of kids, 3 wives. They were good people just trying to better their community. Their house just happened to be on a road that was kind of a border between Al-Qaeda controlled territory and coalition controlled territory. One day we were patrolling the road as we didn't several times per week, and we came across a hole that had been blown into the road, making it impassable by a vehicle. We turned around and got back onto the road a few miles further down and encountered another hole just like the first. Holes were about 2 miles apart and effective created a corridor for Al-Qaeda fighters to cross the road more freely. We dismounted to get to the family's house. Everyone was on edge. Once we arrived at the house, it was immediately noticeable that something was wrong. It was silent and there was a smell surrounding the house. Inside was the most terrible thing I have ever seen. The entire family was gathered into the central room of the house where they were all tortured, raped and murdered. There was maybe a half-inch of blood that was congealing on the floor. If you looked at the scene you could tell the order that it all happened. The father was killed last, the daughters were unclothed and laying face down, the mother and baby were killed with 1 bullet at the same time. By the time we had arrived they had all been dead for 2 or 3 days already. I think about this every day and I've had to stop to cry 3 times just to write it out. I used to work with a woman years ago who was estranged from her husband. The day before her husband was going to take their daughter to Disney World, she smothered her daughter with a pillow and then tried, unsuccessfully, to kill herself. My kids went to visit their mom in the UK on a court-ordered visit. I knew what was going to happen, but couldn't prevent the visit. Sure enough, rather than put them on a plane back to me in the USA, she went on the run with them and her boyfriend. I got a lot of help from the Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the US State Department, and the Scottish government paid all my legal fees over there. During the 5 months she had the kids, she tried to brainwash them. She told them if they came back to me, I would allow them to be molested, and kill them. This was relentless. My son was incredibly strong and refused to believe her or cooperate. They were 13 at the time. But my daughter was much easier to manipulate. I really don't know for certain that they weren't physically abused, but a lot of the stuff she accused me of was things she and her then boyfriend, now husband, did to the children. I had to fly to Scotland to appear in a trial. I walked out of the courthouse at 9 p.m. on a Friday night with the children. Normal process for these cases is to have a designated handover 2 or 3 days later. But the child psychologist who interviewed us all was positive that my ex-wife would kill the children, and the judge agreed. I got them back in the clothes they stood in. I have no doubt she would indeed have killed them rather than hand them over to me. 5 years later, she has no contact with the children, their choice. They have anxiety and depression, but are doing remarkably well. They are high school seniors now, and they make me proud every day. I worked with a guy in Ontario who was always posting on Facebook that he just adopted new puppy like every 4 or 5 months. He adopted them from all different shelters and people had to have about 8 or 9 at one point. We went to his house for some reason and there were no dogs, no signs of dogs, no toys, no food bowls, etc. We asked about the puppies and he just offhandedly pointed to the backyard, which we noticed was full of little mounds, and said they all were sick and died. Guess he just didn't have good luck with animals. The way he said it was cold. The CSPCA investigated him and tested the remains. He was putting small amounts of his own homemade poison in the dog food and conducting his own little LD50 test. In my job I have to interview convicted criminals for court purposes. They have committed all kinds of crimes: rape, murder, domestic violence, child abuse. Some don't talk about their conduct but some do. Most have no concept, or show no understanding or acceptance of how evil they are, which is pretty scary. They justify, minimize, blame others. I have an easy time putting them out of my mind after all these years at my job. But I also have to talk to the victims of their heinous crimes, and that is the worst part of my job. Hard to erase their pain from my brain. I felt like my aunt was pretty evil, and she was a kindergarten teacher no less. She pulled my arm out of its socket one time when I was 4 and she was helping me cross the road. The final visit to her when I was 16, every opportunity she got she would whisper in my ear, "You are worthless, you are nothing," and just keep walking. The visit ended with her trying to strangle me after I took issue with her trying to force feed my brother Ginger, and that was the last time my family spoke to her. I remember fantasizing about getting back at her for some way for a while, but then moved on with my life and grew up. Years later, she was being her typical self with my uncle, her brother, and berating him, calling him worthless, and he shot her in the head, killing her. It was a real tragedy for the family as he shot himself afterwards as well, but I certainly have not missed my aunt. I told this story on Reddit yesterday, so I'll keep this shorter. I had a friend that would threaten to kill herself every night and tell me it was my fault if she did it and everyone would know because I didn't love her as more than friends. It ruined me. And then she started dating my best friend and their relationship was volatile and abusive. Everything she said was lies. I believe she was truly a psychopath. Yeah. When I was 16 to 17, I would go to someone's house to hang out, and they live relatively close to our high school's park. Sometimes there would be this guy at the park. He was a nice guy, a little too nice to me personally, but nonetheless, a nice guy. He would come up to me and we would talk and he would ask if I wanted to hang out with him and his friends. I would tell him no. My mom is expecting me home because stranger danger. Turns out my stranger danger vibe was correct because I found out he raped 2 underage girls. Yeah, dodged a bullet. I've spent a lot of time volunteering in a prison, as a teacher. Every one of my students are good people who made bad decisions and are paying their debt. I've never thought of them as evil, except for one student. Very intelligent man. Serving time for killing his wife in a particularly heinous way. In casual conversation, he refers to her as his ex. Like, my ex and I went to Greece once. I was shocked the first time I heard him do it. She's not your ex-wife, man. She didn't divorce you. You chopped her to pieces. Closest thing to casual evil I've ever seen. I haven't encountered it, but my aunt's side of the family has 2 brothers that are corrupted policemen in China. While on his deathbed, the father's ankles were twisted in attempt to get the inheritance money quicker. She doesn't talk to her brothers anymore and cut contact after the father passed. Fuck those 2, I hope some sick sadistic shit happens to them when they least expect it. I haven't, but I think my GF has. She works at a preschool/daycare. Ages of children vary from infant to /5. She teaches the 3-year-olds in her part of the building. She told me that there is this one 3-year-old girl that is just a heathen. She literally only wants to hurt people. One day she got in trouble for hitting kids on the head with pots and pans. They use these in the sand pit for fun. She brought the little girl inside to talk to her, and the entire time she is just not listening. Mid-sentence the little girl looks at my GF dead in the eyes and says, "Can you let me go outside so I can hit more people?" The next day she was expelled because she just kept hitting kids in the head with pots and pans. Laughing about it. My first job out of college, I worked for a mid-sized telecommunications company selling VoIP to businesses. It was a god-awful job. Not least because it was a very Maccaman environment, and I was a wide-eyed naive 21-year-old girl. The sexual harassment was constant, but the worst offender by far was this guy named Chris. Chris took particular pleasure in belittling me, making sexual comments, hovering over me when I was on calls, gross physical contact, and something worse I wasn't really able to put my finger on at the time. Most of the guys were assholes, but Chris was malicious and always preening. Wore fancy clothes, took a ton of selfies every day, way too much cologne, pocket squares that matched his tie, that type of shit. I left that job after a miserable year, and didn't really think about it much until I saw Chris had gotten some reality TV show with his twin brother, flipping houses or something. Didn't strike me as the type to work with his hands, but whatever. Fast forward to this past spring. It's been 13 years since I left that job. I was picking up our laundry at the laundromat and glanced up at the TV to see Chris's face. It made me shiver just to see it. The guy had been such a bastard, and then I saw the news story wasn't about his reality TV show. Oh no. He allegedly sexually assaulted his 10-year-old daughter's friend while the little girl spent the night at his house. Fuck you, Chris. I hope you're rotting in jail. Edit. I googled him, and being that he's been charged but not sentenced in adding the word allegedly, it appears his defense is that he came home drunk at 1:30 a.m., sat next to the sleeping girl, at which point she woke up and began hitting on him. Rolling eyes face. I know the girl who falsely accused my friend of rape, tried to get him kicked out of university and deported, and ruined his reputation, because her boyfriend found out about their one-night stand. I read the letters she wrote, the things she called him were appalling, it made me sick. Luckily he had saved their text conversations, and her story didn't hold up when cross-referenced with them. He still isn't the same. He had been recovering from depression, which made a swift and terrible comeback due to her. He has sworn to never sleep with someone he doesn't know again. When I see her, nice and smiling with her friends, I can't help but wonder how someone could be capable of such a vile action, just because she didn't want to own up to the fact that she cheated. The sheer uncaring for the well-being of others, the absolute lack of empathy, and the disrespect to actual victims astounds me. If she had gotten her way, his life would be practically over. Also, she could pretend to be a better person. I have never hated someone in my life, and I don't hate her. She doesn't even deserve that, but I wish people like her wouldn't exist.